Hello, this is Kyle from Midnight Paranormal Files. Today we are going to be talking about a topic that has been trending lately because of Netflix, and that is Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, he is an art cannibal, if you haven't known this already, from Wisconsin, kind of like Ed Gein. Um, Anyway, he was a convicted serial killer and sex offender. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 males between 1978 and 1991. He was killed in 1994 by a fellow prison inmate. Who was he? Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer who took the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 91 over the course of more than 13 years. Dahmer sought out men, mostly African American, at gay bars, malls, and bus stops, lured them home with promises of money or sex, and gave them alcohol laced with drugs before strangling them or to death. He would then engage in sex acts with the corpses before dismembering them and disposing of them, often keeping their skulls or genitals as souvenirs. He frequently took photos of his victims at various stages of the murder process so he could recollect each act afterwards and relive the experience. Dahmer was captured in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms. He was killed by a fellow prison inmate, Christopher Scarver, in 94. Childhood and family. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21st, 1960. By the way, the link for the sources will be down in the description for this podcast if you want to check out the articles where I got this from. To Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. He was described as an embryonic and happy child under the age of 4 when surgically to correct a double hernia seemed to effect a change in the boy. Nobly subdued, he became increasingly withdrawn following the birth of his young brother and the family's frequent moves. But his early teens, he was disengaged, tense, and largely friendless. Dahmer claims that his compulsion towards necrophilia and murder began around the age of 14, but it appears that the breakdown of his parents' marriage and their archimedes, I don't know what that word, divorce a few years later may have been the catalyst for turning these thoughts into actions. By the time of his first killing, Dahmer's alcohol consumption had spun out of control. He dropped out of Ohio State University after one quarter term, and he recently remarried. Recently remarried father insisted that he joined the army. Dahmer enlisted in late December 1978 and was posted to Germany shortly thereafter. His drinking problem preceded, and in early 1981, the army discharged him, although German authorities would later investigate possible connections between Dahmer and murders that took place in the area during that time. It is not believed that he took any more victims while serving in the armed forces. Following his discharge, Dahmer returned home to Ohio on arrest later that year for disorderly conduct, prompted his father to send Dahmer to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. But his alcohol problem continued, and he was arrested the following summer of indecent exposure. He was arrested once again in 1986 when two boys accused him of masturbating in front of him. He retrieved a 1 year probationary sentence. Victims. Dahmer murdered 17 men between 1978 and 1991. He was careful to select victims of the fringe of society who were often itinerant or borderline criminal, making their disappearances less noticeable and reducing the likelihood of his capture. He lured them to his home with promises of money or sex, then strangled them to death. He engaged in sex acts with their bodies and kept body parts and photos as souvenirs. Dahmer's first murder occurred just after graduating high school in June 1978 when he picked up a hitchhiker named Steve Hicks and took him home to his parents' house. Dahmer proceeded to get the young man drunk. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer killed him by striking him in the head and strangling him with a bear barbell. Dahmer dismembered the corpse of his first victim, packed the body parts in plastic bags, and buried them behind his parents' home. He later exhumed the remains, crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them across the wooded ravine. It wasn't until September 1987 that Dahmer took his second victim, Steve Toomey. They checked into a hotel room and drank, and Dahmer eventually woke to find Toomey dead with no memory of the previous night's activities. He brought a large suitcase to transport Toomey's body to his grandmother's basement, where he dismembered and masturbated on the corpse before disposing of the remains. Only after Dahmer killed another two victims at his grandmother's home did she try. Did she tire of her grandson's late nights and drunkenness? Although she had no knowledge of his art activities, she forced him to move out of the premises in 1988. That September 1989, Dahmer had an extremely lucky escape and encouraged with a 13-year-old Labtine boy resulted in charges of sexual exploitation and second-degree sexual assault for Dahmer. He pledged guilty, claiming that the body had appeared much older. While awaiting sentence for his sexual assault case, Dahmer again put his grandmother's basement to gruesome use. In March 1989, he lured, drugged, strangled, sodomized, photographed, dismembered, and disposed of Anthony Sears, an aspirin model. At his trial of child molestation in May 1989, Dahmer was the model of contraction. I don't know what it says, to be honest, in his own defense, about how he had seen the error of his ways and that his arrest marked a turning point in his life. His defense counsel argued that he needed treatment, incarnate, not to be locked up in prison, basically. That's what a long word for that is, anyway. And the judge agreed, handing down a 1 year prison sentence on day release, allowing Dahmer to work at his job during the day and returning to prison at night, as well as 5 year probationary sentence. Years later, in an interview with CNN, William Dahmer stated that he wrote a letter to the court that issued the sentence requesting psychological help before his son's parole. However, Dahmer was granted an early release by the judge after serving only 10 months of his sentence. He briefly lived with his grandmother following his release, during which time he did not appear to have added to his body count before moving back in his own apartment. Over the following 2 years, Dahmer's victim count accelerated, bringing his total from 4 to 17. He developed rituals as he progressed, experimenting with chemicals, means of disposal, and also often consuming the flesh of his victims. Dahmer also attempted crude lobotomies, drilling into victims' skulls while they were still alive, injecting them with murderlic acid. I can't even say that word. I can't say a lot of these words. Sound like Jim Leahy off Trailer Park Boys. Where's my liquor? Anyway, on May 27, 1991, Dahmer's neighbor Sandra Smith called the police to report that an Asian boy was running naked in the street. When the police arrived, the boy was incoherent, and they accepted the world of Dahmer, a white man in a largely poor African American community, that the boy was his 19-year-old lover. In fact, the boy was 14-year-old and a brother of Laird Teen Dahmer had molested 3 years earlier. The police escorted Dahmer and the boy home, clearly not wishing to become embroiled in a homosexual domestic disturbance. They took only a cursory look around before leaving. Once the police left the scene, Dahmer killed the boy and proceeded with his usual rituals. They conducted even the basic search of police officers would have found the body of Dahmer's 12th victim, Tony Hughes, before he was finally arrested. Dahmer's killed 4 more men. The criminal scene at Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, refrigerator, and Polaroids. Dahmer's killing spree ended when he was arrested on July 22nd, 1991. The body parts found in Dahmer's refrigerator and Polaroid photographs of his victims became inexplicably associated with his notorious killing spree. 2 Milwaukee police officers were led to Dahmer when they picked up Tracy Edward, a 32-year-old African American man who was wandering the streets with handcuffs dangling from his wrists. They decided to investigate the man's claim that a weird dude has drugged and restrained him. They arrived at Dahmer's apartment, where he claimed calmly offered to get the keys for the handcuffs. Edwards claimed that the knife Dahmer had threatened him with was in the bedroom. When the officer went to corroborate the story, he noticed Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies laying around. Dahmer was subdued by the officers. Oh, they did a search, revealed a head in the refrigerator, 3 more in the freezer, and a catalog of our horrors, including preserved skulls, jars, containers, genitals, and exhibits gallery of macabre Polaroid photos of his victims. In 1996, following Dahmer's death, a group of Milwaukee businessmen raised more than $400,000 to purchase the items he used for his victims, including blades, saws, handcuffs, and a refrigerator to store the body parts. They promptly destroyed them in an effort to distance the city from the horrors of Dahmer's actions and the ensuing media circus surrounding his trial. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. Given that the majority of Dahmer's victims were African American, there were considerably racial tensions. Strict security precautions were taken, including an 8-foot barrier of bulletproof glass that separated him from the gallery. The inclusion of only one African American on the jury provoked further unrest, but was ultimately contained and short lived. Leon Dahmer and his second wife attended to the trial throughout. Dahmer intentionally pleaded not guilty to all charges despite having confessed to killing three to the killings during the police interrogations. He eventually charged his plea guilty by various of virtual of insanity. His defense then offered the gruesome details of his behavior as proof that only someone insane could commit such terrible acts. Jury chose to believe the person's acceleration that Dahmer was fully aware that his acts were evil and chose to commit them anyway. On February 15, 1992, the return after approximately 10 hours since buried to find him guilty but sane on all courts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison with a 16th term tacked on in May. Dahmer reportedly adjusted well to prison life. Although he was initially kept apart from the general population, he eventually convicted authorities allow him to integrate more fully with our inmates. He found religion in the form of books and photos sent to him by his father, and he was granted permission by the Columbia Correctional Institute to be baptized by a local pastor. Dahmer was killed on November 28th, 1994, by his fellow prison inmate Christopher Scarver. And accounts with his inclusion and regular work details, Dahmer was assigned to work with two other convicted murderers, Scarver and Jesse Anderson. After they had been left alone to complete their task, guards returned to find that Scarver had brutally beaten both men with a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer was pronounced dead after approximately 1 hour. Anderson stumbled to his injuries days later. In 2015, Scarver spoke to the New York Post about his reasons for killing Dahmer. Scarver alleged that he was disturbed not only by Dahmer's crimes, but a habit Dahmer had developed of fashioning served limbs from prison foods to antagonize our inmates. After being taunted by Dahmer and Anderson during their work detailed, Scarver said that he confronted Dahmer about his crimes before beating the two men to death. He also claimed that prison guards allowed the murders to happen by leaving them alone. Jeffrey Dahmer's house. In August 2012, nearly 2 decades after his death, it was reported that Dahmer's childhood home in Bath, Ohio, where he committed his first murder in 1978 and buried his victims' remains, was on the market. Its owners, musician Chris Butler, stated that the property would make a great home as long as the buyer could get past the horror factor. In March 2016, Butler put the house up for rent for $8,000 for the week of the Republican National Convention. As of July 2017, the house was no longer listed on the market, according to Zello.com. Yeah, the story about Jeffrey Dahmer is pretty disturbing, to say the least. Now there is a lot of these places are haunted. Like Dahmer's apartment building is haunted by, or people have seen shadowy figures and heard the victims still cry from the grounds and stuff like that. That's from his apartment. Um, Now, the place that Jeffrey Dahmer's, like his childhood home or whatever, one of his child homes, even though he was from Milwaukee, uh, or that's where he was born. Steve Hicks is said to be roams on this 1.5 acres of this house that he grew up in and stuff. that's in our place. Jeffrey Dahmer's grandma's house is supposedly haunted. It says that their victims could still you could still hear the victims' painful moans and sad cries, strange noises and dragging sounds also have been uh, heard too. Besides, now the Columbia Correctional Facility in Portage, Wisconsin, is not open to ghost hunts because it's still an active prison and stuff. But anyway, uh, they inmates have experienced the hauntings of the Campbell himself, lurking and leering. A shadowy figure has been seen in the area where Dahmer was killed in, and the cell. The serial killer called home. It may be the even in the afterlife, Dahmer has to serve an eternal sentence without any hope of parole. And that's the whole story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the hauntings behind it, and his life story. I hope you guys like this podcast. Make sure to follow us if you haven't already. Uh, Share this podcast with your friends if you haven't already. And I'll talk to you guys in the next podcast.